Okay, good afternoon, everyone. And this is a somewhat abbreviated portion. This is just to complete our class from Wednesday, and it's to complete our introduction to study of biology and to tell you a little bit about science itself and how science works. One of the principles that we talked about when we're trying to decide what life was, what characterized life, is the fact that living things do something with energy and matter. They do something orderly with energy and matter. Metabolism is one of the characteristics of living things. And when we ask what the metabolism actually is, that is exactly what it is. It's doing something with energy and with matter. We are composed of matter. Our molecules are made of elements which we have to get from somewhere. And they are put together, broken up, changed from one form to another, etc., with the use of energy, because all of those metabolic processes are in fact work. And that is the definition of energy. Energy is the capacity to do work. But there is a catch. When you use energy in this manner, what you're doing is usually you're transforming energy from one form to another. The laws of thermodynamics tell us two things that are really important for biology. And the first is that energy, you cannot create it and you cannot destroy it, but you can change it from one form to another. There's a catch though, and that is that every time you do that, every time you transform from one form to another, you do so inefficiently, and you will lose some energy as heat. Heat is biologically useless. There's no living system that can actually use heat to drive metabolic processes. It is waste energy, and ultimately on the whole planet, it is radiated back out to space. The same is not true of the molecules that make up biomass. Biomass is the living tissue, the living molecules, the molecules that make up the living organism. That is biomass, and is made of molecules. That on our planet, we only have a finite number of molecules. We get very little input of molecules and very little loss. A little tiny bit of input from the space, a little tiny bit of loss from the atmosphere, but it's nothing compared to the bulk of the molecules which are held against the planet by gravity. That number of molecules that we have on the planet is finite. It is set. And all living processes have to make use of a set number of molecules. This is a problem, because if as a living entity was to gather molecules, put them all into living biological molecules, and then never release those molecules again, if when that organism died, it did not decay, it just kept all the molecules, then very soon we would lock up all the molecules that are useful to life in these dead organisms. That is not what happens. Instead, those molecules get recycled, and we're going to see how that is done in a minute. So the take-home message from this is that energy flow is one way through our biosphere. We receive an input and then it radiates. We actually receive it as light, and then it radiates back out as heat and is lost. The molecules, however, get recycled over and over and over again. So there is all of our ecosystems depend on the fact that plants are able to use sun's light. They're able to convert sunlight into chemical energy. It's an absolutely incredible process, and without it, everything would grind to a halt. The sunlight radiates down to the earth, plants photosynthesize, and they change that sunlight energy into chemical energy. They put it into chemical bonds, which are also potential energy. They contain energy which can be used later for other purposes. And everything else depends on it. Those organisms which are able to take very simple molecules, carbon dioxide and water, and the sun's energy, and bind those carbon dioxide and water molecules together to form complex biomolecules. using the energy from the sun, those we call autotrophs, self-feeders. We also refer to them as being the producers. Everything else on the planet depends basically on the molecules which plants create. We take those molecules and we change them over and over and over again in all sorts of different ways. We don't just leave those molecules as they were. We transform them. And every time those transformations take place, that requires energy. Those energy is derived from the chemical bonds. But every time we do that, we lose energy. We radiate some heat out. And if you don't believe me, put your hand on your arm and feel the warmth, because that warmth is generated by your own metabolism. That is your metabolism, which is actually slightly inefficient, and you're losing heat the whole time. You yourself require a constant source of energy for that very reason. So plants are the producers, we are consumers, we are heterotrophs. We depend on molecules already made. So when we have let's just have a look at this diagram. It explains it perfectly clearly. And it's as follows. We've already said, we depend on light energy coming in from the sun. Plants, or the photosynthesizers rather, are the only things which can take that light energy and convert it. They can convert the light energy into chemical energy. They, at the same time, they take in molecules. They take up some chemicals from the soil, but mostly from the air. They take carbon dioxide. They take water, which they absorb from the soil, and they combine carbon dioxide and water, and they form complex biomolecules. And it is on those complex biomolecules contain two things. The first thing is they contain matter, which we use to build the biomass. But second of all, they contain energy locked into those chemical bonds. And we can use that energy for all sorts of things. We can transform that energy over and over and over and over again. And that is what organisms do that feed on the plants. So they use all of that chemical energy to do work, and they use the molecules to build biomass. Again, every time you transform energy, they're going to radiate heat out into the atmosphere, out into space, ultimately. So energy is continually lost. Energy flow is one way through these systems. We cannot recycle. The chemicals, on the other hand, remember what I told you. If this caterpillar, when it died, didn't decay, all those molecules were locked into the caterpillar. Well, that would mean those molecules would not be available for other things to use. Death and decay are essential parts of life, because these molecules have to be recycled. They have to be reused. They have to be reused by the plants, by all the other consumers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The ultimate decay is to carbon dioxide and to water. So they go back, ultimately goes back to the very simple building blocks that plants use to build the original biomolecules. So the chemicals on Earth are cycled over and over again. We recycle them. They have to reuse them. Whereas energy flow is one way. Okay, so that is basic. We return to this theme when we talk about metabolism. We're going to talk about metabolism. We're going to talk about photosynthesis as well. So remember what the basics that we have seen here. Okay, I just want to say a little bit about scientific method. This is especially important in these days, because at the moment we are being flooded with information, some of which is scientific about the COVID crisis, and a lot of which is not non-scientific. And for a scientist can clearly distinguish between the two, because the science has certain disciplines. It has certain rules that we abide by. And it really is important for you to understand what those rules are. So the science, the word, is derived from Latin and means to know. And it's a system of inquiry. Scientists are always asking questions. They're always They're always examining things and trying to work out how they work. They ask questions the whole time. The very first step in any scientific endeavor is exactly that. It's observation. It's observing certain things, certain phenomena. And the scientist is distinguished from other observers because they acquire data. They acquire either qualitative data, descriptive data, or they acquire quantitative data in the form of statistics, of numbers. If you only make observations, there's nothing wrong with just making observations. You fall into the realm really of natural history. So a natural historian is simply a natural historian counts the birds in his garden and learns their names. Okay, doesn't go any further than that. There's nothing wrong with that. It's very, very interesting. And natural history, in fact, formed the basis of much of biological science in the old days. And many important questions have arisen out of natural history, out of simple observation. But because somebody started to acquire data as a result of their observations and began to ask questions which could explain that data, could explain what they saw in the data. And in order to do so, a scientist will form a hypothesis. And a hypothesis is a logical guess. It's a logical guess to explain what is being observed. In science, the critical thing that distinguishes science from everything else is the hypothesis is made, and the hypothesis is then tested. And after testing, the hypothesis is either accepted or it is rejected. So this is not making observations and just pulling out a wild explanation and saying that must be it because I think it's that. Okay, that is not what a scientist does. A scientist poses an hypothesis and then tests that hypothesis and either accepts it or rejects it. Nowadays, you'll often see people say, "I've done all this research on whatever, on vaccinations, and I did all this research on the internet, and science shows that X happens." That's not science. Okay? Science consists of making hypotheses to try to explain something and performing experiments to test that hypothesis. And it's a very rigorous process. And scientists are always ready to reject their hypotheses, no matter how fond they are of their guess, of their best guess. They must always be ready to reject them because that opens up the possibility of moving to other hypotheses which could be correct. And if it does happen, scientists sometimes accept the wrong hypothesis. They make the wrong interpretation and they accept the wrong hypothesis. Very importantly in science, science doesn't sit alone in somebody's head. It is published. It is put out into the public realm. It is it should be a transparent process. Sometimes scientists make the wrong conclusion. They accept the wrong hypothesis, but other scientists examining the same data can see more clearly that in fact another hypothesis is more likely. That's the process of science. We must always be ready to have the hypothesis knocked down and somebody else tell us, no, proceed in this direction to find the correct answer. Excuse me. So in talking about all of these things, we also need to recognize that there are various ways in which we as human beings think. There's ways in which we come to form hypotheses or questions, and there's ways in which we come to form conclusions as well. And the first of these is systems of inductive reasoning. And inductive reasoning draws conclusions simply by putting a logical endpoint on a series of observations. So that is called induction. And if you repeat specific observations, and you get certain results, you can make generalizations about them, which are very probably true if you've done enough observations. So for example, every single day, if we get up early enough, you'll see the sun rise in the east. Well, inductive reasoning suggests to you that the sun always rises in the east. It's never been observed to rise in the west. And therefore, tomorrow the sun will rise in the east. That is a process of inductive reasoning, and it's quite probably correct. Very often, inductive reasoning can lead to hypothesis formation or to conclusion, a valid conclusion. Here's another one. Whenever a predatory bird approaches a group of meerkats sitting on top of a rock or whatever, there is one guard meerkat who keeps an eye open on the sky, and the predatory bird arises. That guard will call and everybody will dive for cover to hide away from the predatory bird. What's your inductive conclusion? Your inductive conclusion is that the call is a warning call. It's a warning call. What's important about this? Well, that in itself, that inductive conclusion could lead you to suggest hypotheses and to experiment. For example, you could record the call and play it and see if they bolted for cover. Okay, that sort of thing. This is not an end point, it's a beginning. You can move on from, similarly here, as we're going to see in a while, we can move on from inductive and inductive conclusion in certain ways. So this idea of the hypothesis is very, very important in science. Again, it's a tentative answer, but it must be to a well-framed question. It's not thumb-sucking. It really is a tentative answer, but that word tentative is important. You must be ready to throw it out. And it must be rational. It's got to be a rational. There's something that depends on known physical, chemical, etc. principles. And thirdly, it leads to predictions. And those predictions can be tested. The predictions from the hypothesis are tested in one of two ways. Sometimes they're tested by further rigorous observation. Rigorous observation is really more inductive reasoning. Or else they can be tested by experiment. And when they're proved or disproved by experiment, that is more deductive reasoning, which I'll explain in a minute. So we either perform rigorous observation to accept or reject our hypothesis, or much more frequent in science, we set up experiments to prove or disprove hypotheses. Let's take an ordinary household situation and see how this works. You have a flashlight in your house. Now, flashlight doesn't work. So that's your observation. My flashlight's not working. So you have, what is the question you frame? Why doesn't it work? Why not? You can hypothesize. You can make a number of hypotheses. Hypothesis 1, batteries are dead. That's probably the first thing any of us would think of. Hypothesis 2, the bulb is burned out. That's equally likely. We could have a third hypothesis. One of the batteries has been put in back to front. Let's keep that in mind as a third hypothesis. So what are you going to do? Well, if the batteries are dead, what is your prediction? What is a logical prediction? Well, the logical prediction is if I replace the batteries, the flashlight will work. Now you test it. That's your experiment. You replace the batteries. The result doesn't work. What have you got to do? You have to reject this hypothesis here. Okay, that hypothesis goes. Hypothesis number 2, the bulb is burned out. Well, you do the same thing. We make a prediction. If I replace the bulb, it's going to work, right? What's your experiment? You replace the bulb. Now the flashlight works. Bingo. You accept this hypothesis. The bulb was burned out. There's some important questions to ask. What about hypothesis 3? One of the batteries was reversed. Do we need to move on to hypothesis 3? No. We have a total explanation here. We have a complete explanation. right? The hypothesis number 2, bulb was burned out. That is a complete explanation which satisfactorily answers the question. We don't need to proceed. You don't need. What's something else? What was not a hypothesis? Well, if somebody came along when you were fiddling with your flashlight trying to get it to work, and they said, "Oh, your flashlight is cursed. That's why it's not working." Or somebody said, "Oh dear, the flashlight fairies have interfered or interfering, and they're stopping your flashlight from working." Is there anything scientific that we can do about that? No. Why not? Because those cannot be tested by hypothesis. They cannot be tested by erecting a hypothesis and then experimenting and testing your hypothesis. It's impossible. Those are matters of belief. And that's another realm altogether. It is not science. It is not science because it's not open to hypothesis formation, which can be tested by experiment or rigorous observation. So as I told you that there are different things that can be done. And I said to you that often we move to forming new hypotheses, and often by deduction. And this is the second kind of reasoning. Deductive reasoning is very strongly associated with hypothesis formation and with testing and experiment. And because it leads us to make specific prediction. And the predictions are of a different kind. It's not a repetition of what has been observed before, right? It is a prediction about what we might observe if conditions change using principles of our hypothesis. So any initial observation can give rise to numerous multiple hypotheses. Let's go back to what we saw when we watched the sunrise. We said inductive reasoning, sun always rises in the east because it's always been observed to rise in the east. Conditions have not changed from one day to the next, and so is it going to rise in the east again? What is a deduction we can make from it? Well, they're numerous, and they are all of them open to experimentation, and they've all been experimented on. The first is that the earth is round. Okay, that is why we observe the sun rising in the east. Another one might be that the earth revolves around the sun. There's another one, that the earth actually is revolving the whole time. That's why the sun comes up and moves across the sky and then it sinks in the west. Another one, the sun always rotates towards the east. Each of these can be tested. These can form the basis of hypotheses, and they can and have been in remote times tested to show that they are true. So again, I repeat, there are things which the science and the hypotheses will not answer, and those are questions of faith and questions of belief. And that is a different matter altogether, which I'm not involved in, and which we don't discuss. Again, they're outside the bounds of science. So why? Because hypotheses formed from them cannot be tested. It's impossible to test those hypotheses. So I will tell you that science is not always a rigid process. There are sometimes boundaries between deductive reasoning are loose, and sometimes the boundaries between observation and experiment are fairly loose. And scientists tend to jump forward, go back, jump forward, go back, jump forward, go back. But there is a central thing about science which needs to be understood, and that is that science is a process of building. We build science, knowledge upon knowledge upon knowledge. New knowledge is acquired, newer knowledge is acquired on the basis of that, newer knowledge on the basis of that, newer knowledge on the basis of that. Often, it requires breaking down previously held scientific beliefs, and then rebuilding. Okay, so science is a continual process. Scientists very seldom arrive at a single definitive answer which applies. They usually are only answering part of a problem for a start, and they expect their work to be challenged. They expect their work to be criticized, and in that challenge and criticism, for new work to be built upon it. And so rethinking is something a scientist needs to do be prepared to do over and over again. So let's have a look at a real scientific experiment, a biological experiment. This was actually performed. Here it is relatively simplified. So what are the observations? The observations are, when we look at nature, we see the color patterns of animals. They vary very widely. And they will even vary between members of the same species. So we see a population of mice in one area and a population of mice in another area. Their colors may vary one from the other. Well, that's very interesting. Why are their colors varying? Hypothesis. The color depends on their environment. The color matches to their environment so that they are camouflaged. That is an hypothesis. Here's a case where this is actually true. It's a little mouse called Peromyscus polyonotus. And even though it's the same species, it extends all the way from the coast, all the way inland. And when you look at the beach populations, they are very light colored. When you look at the inland populations, they are dark. So here they are here. You might even be forgiven for thinking that they are different species, but they are not. They're exactly the same species. If you take a brown one and you take a gray one, you put them together, they'll happily breed with one another. So here they are in the beach population, here they in the inland population, and our hypothesis is that this coloration is camouflage. It's to fit them to their background environment so they can't be seen by predators. Well, that simple hypothesis can easily be tested. We don't even have to sacrifice mice to do it, because all we have to do is make models of the mice, and that is what these scientists did. This is what these experimenters did. They're based upon these following observations. They match the color, and their predators hunt by sight. So what do we deduce from that? Predators have got to see their prey, and camouflage would protect the prey. So we hypothesize that these colors have evolved to protect the mice, and we test it in the following way. They built models, little tiny models, the right size of the mice in different colors, and they put them into the two different habitats as follows. So on the beach habitat, they made light models. Here's one here, and they made dark models, and here's one here. They actually had a way of monitoring how many times those models were attacked, because what would have happened was the predator would think it was a mouse, fly down, grab it, and then realize it's not a mouse and would drop it. And so they had a way of measuring how many times it had been grabbed and dropped. And these are the results they got. So what they did in the beach habitat, they put out both gray mice and brown mice. And in the inland habitat, the same thing. They put out gray mice and they put out brown mice. And they counted how many times were they attacked. In the beach habitat, they about just over 25% of their models were attacked. And when you look at the dark models, nearly 75% of the dark models were attacked. In the inland dark habitats, they looked at the non-camouflaged, and they saw that the light ones against the dark background were predated. More than 75% of them had been predated. About the same percentage, 25% of the camouflaged were. So it looks like the camouflage provides strong protection. Now we haven't proceeded here with the next step, which in scientific paper, if you're going to publish these results, you would proceed to test these statistically to provide statistical backing for your conclusions. But you don't need those statistics. You can see the result quite clearly. Camouflage, correct camouflage, provides strong protection against predation. And in fact, it should even be probably be less. We can hypothesize, again, we develop another hypothesis, that when you have something which is sitting there still, it's likely to be grabbed more often. A living mouse may have even less predation than this. There's something else that needs to be pointed out. Let me just restructure this experiment for us. And let's just say I don't worry about this. I don't put a light one out on the beach. I don't put a dark one out on the inland. I just put out light ones inland and dark ones on the beach. And I get these results, 75%, nearly 75% of them are attacked. What conclusions could I possibly draw from that? What conclusions can you, that might answer our hypothesis that camouflage protects? There's absolutely no answer. There's no answer whatsoever. It doesn't tell you anything. It just tells you that mice get attacked. That's all that there is. That's all that there is to it. No, this experiment doesn't work unless you have a control. You have something that approximates the normal condition. And that is the camouflaged mouse in each case. This one here, the light one on the beach, is a control. That approaches the normal condition. The non-camouflage is our experiment. And ideally, the control should differ from the experiment in one factor only. We don't have the mouse, one of these mice, dark and with a short tail, right? We keep the conditions so that the difference, there's only one difference between these two, as far as possible. Not always possible in an experiment, but we do, because other factors become confounding. They make it difficult to draw a conclusion about what was really the determining factor. But in this case, here, the camouflage mouse, here the dark one in inland, the light one on the beach, those are the controls, and the two others are the experiment. And it is the presence of control and experiment together that allows us to make a clear conclusion. So I just want to also just finish up with telling you that bit by telling you there is one special circumstance in science, and that is when we're trying to elucidate a whole system which is itself not available for a single kind of hypothesis, single experiment that might prove an hypothesis. And this is for huge overarching systems, which we call theory. Now, scientific theory does not mean the same thing as it does in common parlance. Theory in common parlance just means, oh, a vague idea, right? I've got a theory that 5G causes COVID, whatever. That's a theory. It's a vague thing that probably can't be tested and proved. A scientific theory is something which is supported by a large body of evidence, a large, rigorously acquired body of evidence. It cannot itself be tested, but parts of it can be tested. It by deduction, leads to hypotheses which can themselves be tested. And in that context, a scientific theory, is broader in scope than a single hypothesis. It can lead to testable hypotheses, certainly, and it must be supported by a large body of evidence. And there are things which are just so familiar to us, we don't realize the importance of that word theory in their names. We talk about the theory of evolution. We talk about the theory of gravity. We talk about the theory of relativity. That word theory has a specific scientific meaning. It means it's so vast a field, we can't address the whole thing in a single experiment. Right? We can't address it with a single hypothesis. Instead, we look at parts, and it leads to experimentation and observation, all of which should come back to confirm the theory. There have been theories which have eventually died. For example, the theory of spontaneous generation of life. For a very long time, scientists believed that that life arose continually. Cells were produced continuously from inanimate matter. It's not true, but it took a long time before that theory was squelched. For these, evolution, gravity, relativity, these are well accepted, well supported theories which have led to very vast numbers of hypotheses and experiments which have shown them to be true. I'll just conclude by telling you a little bit, because you may not know, how a scientific work proceeds. Scientific work never ends up in somebody's head or in a desk drawer and sits there. That is not science. That's self-indulgence. Science, true science, leads to the work being put out into the public, being put out not only to the general public, it's available to the general public, but especially it's put out to peers in the same field so that they can examine that work, determine whether the methods were correct, determine whether the correct hypotheses were drawn up, and whether the experimental results support or reject the hypothesis. Scientists do make mistakes, but those mistakes very soon become public and very soon become visible and may be corrected. That's an essential part of science. And in addition, as I've said before, scientists need other scientists' work to proceed with their own. Scientific work always leads to should always lead to further work, further hypothesis development, etc. Okay, so for the moment, I believe that is that, and I will see you then on Monday.